at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which sponsors this event, as well as the more general project, is a multi-year project on the Jesuits and globalization, of which this event is kind of the first initial meeting. We had a meeting today, bringing experts on the history of the Jesuits and the Jesuit mission. And today we are going to have a discussion around this topic of the Jesuits, the early global mission, and interreligious encounter and dialogue, only a few decades after their foundation in 1540. The Jesuits had missions in South Asia, in Japan, in South America, in Paraguay, in Brazil, but also basically all over the world. So we want to reflect upon this early global mission and what it can teach us about the role of the Jesuits in process of globalization that had led us to the contemporary global age, and how these early global missions are related to our contemporary process of globalization. To discuss those issues, we have a prominent group of scholars. First, Father Jan O'Malley, a prominent historian, university professor at the Department of Theology here at Georgetown, the author of many, many books on the Jesuits, but also on early modern Europe. The first Jesuits, perhaps the definitive work on the foundation of the order and the first years, the development of the order, but also the editor of two important volumes on the Jesuits and science, culture, and the arts. Also a book on the Second Vatican Council, and also history of the popes, Trent and all that, and most recently, a history of the Council of Trent. He will give us a kind of a general overview of the early global mission. Then Father Anthony Husserler, a historian of the early global empires, has spent a lot of time in Japan, expert on the Jesuit Christian encounter in Japan, but also on East Asia. We'll be talking about precisely the the Jesuit encounter in Japan and in China. Then Father Franz Clooney, a professor of comparative theology at Harvard University, expert on Hinduism and the classical Sanskrit and Tamil Hindu text, will be discussing the encounter of the Jesuits with the cultures and religions of India. And then Professor Barbara Ganson, who is at Atlantic Florida University, the author of a very important book on the Guarani under Spanish rule, perhaps one of the most interesting missions of the Jesuits in Paraguay. We'll be discussing the Jesuits' mission both in South America, the Guarani, but in Iberoamerica in general. So each of the presenters will have 10 minutes, so a very, very small time we have allotted to them. There will be the possibility of some conversation among them briefly before we open up the floor for discussion. So without further ado, Professor O'Malley.
Thank you. All I want to do is sort of lay the foundation, sort of some foundation stones in the very early years of the Jesuits that help account for their global mission and the way they went about it. Two preliminary remarks. One is, I think in dealing with this subject, we have to avoid falling into what's known as the fallacy of inflated difference, that the Jesuits were part of a whole movement in Catholicism. They followed on the footsteps of the mendicants and so forth. So we don't want to exaggerate their uniqueness or their special character. On the other hand, the way they spoke about themselves was that they had a way of proceeding, which I think we can translate into a kind of a style or a how they went about things. And if they are distinctive in any way, it's to a large extent because of their style. So I want to talk about that a little bit. But just to, again, I have 10 points for 10 minutes. So, first point, the times. Remember, they were founded just as the age of European exploration was in its maturity, you might almost say. They were founded in 1540, and the Portuguese have been going around the Cape of Good Hope for a long time, and then the discoveries of the so-called New World and Asia and so forth, the so-called Indies. So they rode initially, at least, on the galleons of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire. So that's part of the whole context. The second context is the mendicant orders, especially the Dominicans and Franciscans, but the Mercedarians and the Augustinians and so forth, that they were doing missionary work long before the Jesuits came on the scene. Indeed, my own interpretation of the Jesuit beginning, their first 7 or 8 years, was although they didn't think about themselves this way, they basically were kind of an updated version of the mendicants, but with certain special characteristics, but they were in that footpath. Then, after a point, they diverged, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Another basic point to remember about the first Jesuits, so the first 10 Jesuits, they were all had Master of Arts degrees from the University of Paris. This is an extremely important feature of their beginning. These Masters of Arts degrees were certainly not quite the equivalent of a contemporary PhD, but they come close. And to have a group, 10 men, with this kind of qualification is really very special. And for one thing this gave them, they had a very reflective way of going about what they were doing. And that's especially clear in the way they went about founding the order, that they sat together for 2 months off and on and created a formula, a plan of living. So it's already a very reflective way of going about their business, and an orderly way of going about their business. And this is, again, part, it seems to me, of their way of proceeding. And St. Ignatius' secretary, Polanco, makes a big point of this, that part of our procedure is to do it in orderly fashion and in a reflective fashion. Then another thing to say about these 10 first companions were they were international from the beginning. They met in Paris, and none of them were French. They were Portuguese, Spaniards, or Savoyard. And they met in alien territory, you might say, for themselves. And then they moved to Italy, which again was not their native soil. So there's this dimension to them as well. In this way, they were unlike the other religious orders that were founded at that same time, which were all founded in Italy, basically remained in Italy. Capuchins would be a little bit of an exception to this, and had a very Italian focus and a very European focus. But the Jesuits were, as I say, international from the beginning. Then I mentioned their formula, the program of life. Basically what they said about themselves was that they were founded to be missionaries. That's what we are going to do is to go to the heretics, schismatics, infidels, and even to Christians. So they had this sort of international scope to begin with, and their famous fourth vow was basically this vow to obey the Pope regarding missions, was basically a vow to be missionaries. It was a vow to be mobile, very much in contrast with, say, a monk who has a vow of stability. So again, in their constitutions that was written by St. Ignatius and by his secretary Polanco, it is according to our vocation. It's our vocation to travel to various parts of the world. So we are travelers. We go places. We do things. And another interesting thing in the formula in the 1550 revised version is it lists a lot of sort of, you might say, evangelical goals that the Jesuits had here: confessions, distribute the sacraments, and so forth, to take care of prisoners and orphans. But then the final word was, anything that promotes the common good. Now, other religious orders certainly were doing things about the common good, but it seems to me this is the first time that this is clearly articulated as part of what a religious order was all about. And so, then they had these documents. They had the spiritual exercises, which of course were written by a layman. Ignatius, when he was a layman, it was meant for everybody. It was not specifically meant for Jesuits, because there were no Jesuits when he basically wrote it. But in the exercises, the meditation on the kingdom of Christ, to go and to follow this leader, to spread the gospel, to spread the good news, and this has all kinds of sort of allegorical interpretations, but also is very much, it seems to be, a part of what the Jesuits picked up and what Ignatius had in mind as to a description of a real Christian. And then the constitutions themselves, very understudied, underrated document. It's a cluttered document, but extraordinarily important. Nothing quite like it seems to me, in the history of the world up to that time for a religious order. But the ninth part is about the qualities of the general. And one of those qualities was magnanimitas, that the general should be a person who was ready to undertake great things and suffer great hardships because of undertaking great things. And this is the sort of the ideal general. It's also the ideal Jesuit. It's a portrait of what the ideal Jesuit should be like. So this going out there and doing big things was there. Another thing they had in terms of organization was a strong central authority, unlike the mendicant orders. The mendicant orders were very much locally governed and energized. I remember visiting the Dominican convent in Salamanca, and in one of the chapter room, there was a plaque saying, in this chapter room, the first missionaries were elected to go to the New World. So it was a very local enterprise there. This was not so much the case with the Jesuits. And then, although the Ignatius put a lot of emphasis on obedience, they could not be micromanaged, and they never intended to be micromanaged. So there was a lot of room for local initiative, and Ignatius has often said about him in his letters that never in the history of religious order were subjects told, well, here's something you should do, here's a way of going about it, unless you, being there on the spot, see something that would be better. So then finally, after a very short time, after 7 or 8 years, they went into the business of schools. And this was new for a religious order in the sense of taking on formal schooling as a ministry of the order for laymen. So for people who are going to be in the world. And the program of this education was basically the humanist program, that is to say, literature, poetry, history, drama, subjects that were not clerical. And this means that the Jesuits themselves had an education that was different from other clerics. And it was kind of a worldly, these were pagan authors, kind of at one foot into the world, and the central discipline was rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and in the basic principle of rhetoric, to be a good orator, to be a good persuader, you must be in touch with the feelings and aims and fears of the audience. So this kind of accommodating yourself to the audience is part of the rhetorical, and this was the Jesuits' central discipline, really. So this helped them in their attempt to reach out to other people. And finally, then along that same line, the impact of the other upon the Jesuits. That it was a two-way street, and one striking example of the two-way street is the schools. That the schools, they undertook this as a ministry, but the schools changed them. and made them more worldly, gave them a different kind of education, and so forth. So those are just a few of the, what you might call the foundation stones or the germs out of which this organization and its ethos grew.
And Francis Xavier left even before the order was formally established and approved, right?
That's correct.
So, Professor Husserler.
Thank you very much.
From there.
Well, I've titled these remarks, The Jesuits in East Asia in the Early Modern Age, A New Areopagus and the Reinvention of Christianity. So when we speak about the Jesuits' global approach to engaging other cultures in the 16th and 17th centuries, one of the key geographical areas that comes to mind, as has been mentioned, is East Asia. In these brief remarks, I shall discuss the diverse and yet unified approach that the Jesuits adopted in their engagement with the peoples of Japan and China. We often hear the expression inculturation or cultural adaptation or accommodation cited as one of the defining characteristics of the Jesuit missions in these countries. But we must ask what inspired such a stance, and we've already heard a number of reasons from Father O'Malley. Was it simple pragmatism and expediency, or was there a deeper underlying theological vision that informed the decisions that the Jesuits would make when establishing a Christian presence among the warlords of Japan and the mandarins and scholars of China? Now, at a very basic human level, the first encounters with the Japanese and the Chinese saw the Jesuits expressing very concrete anthropological assessments of their interlocutors. The discoveries of the Americas had initiated a debate in Europe about the existence of a shared human nature, or lack thereof, as the case may be with the Amerindians, and we think of the famous debate between Sepúlveda in 1550-1551 with Francisco de Vitoria in Salamanca. It did not take long before Europeans began to make distinctions between the peoples of the Americas, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and finally East Asia. Francis Xavier, in his first letter from Japan, written in Kagoshima on the 5th of November, 1549, spoke of the Japanese as the, quote, best people yet discovered, unquote. This sentiment would be echoed by his successor and organizer of the East Asian Jesuit missionary enterprise, Alessandro Valignano, who first landed in Japan in 1579 and who would travel between Macau, Japan, and India while coordinating Jesuit activities for 27 years thereafter. In his Sumario de las Cosas de Japón, or Summary on Things Japanese, completed in 1583, Valignano notes how, quote, of all the peoples of the East, only the Japanese are moved to become Christians by their own free will, convinced by reason, convencidos de razón, and desirous of their own salvation, unquote. Both he and Matteo Ricci, whom he sent from Goa to Macau to begin studying the Chinese language in 1582, would make similar statements about the people of the Middle Kingdom. In a letter from Beijing, dated 15th of February 1609, Ricci claims that, quote, in ancient times, the Chinese followed the natural law more fully than in our countries. And 1,500 years ago, this people was not inclined to the worship of idols. And those they did adore were not like the evil idols worshipped by the Egyptians, Greeks, or Romans, but rather men whom they considered virtuous and who had performed many good deeds. On the contrary, the books of the literati, which are the most ancient and authoritative among their writings, do not adore anything but heaven and earth and the Lord of both. And if we examine these books, we will find little therein against the light of reason, and much that is in conformity with it. And we can hope in divine mercy, and that many of their ancient sages were saved by their observance of the natural law, with the help that God would have given them on account of their natural goodness, unquote. These assessments had profound consequences on what the Jesuits chose to do next. If the Japanese and the Chinese could be compared to the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, and if they were even better than them in some respects, then the theological horizon within which to build the Christian community in Asia came into a much clearer focus. One of the key contemplative tools of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola is the compositio loci, or composition of place, namely the vivid reimagination of a biblical scene. To comprehend how they were to proceed, the Jesuits reimagined or placed themselves in three distinct scenes from the Acts of the Apostles. First, they looked upon Paul's debate with the Greeks at the Areopagus over the identity of the unknown God in their pantheon of different gods. Secondly, they beheld the scene at Pentecost where peoples gathered from different nations heard the apostles speaking to them in their own language. And thirdly, they reflected on the disagreement between Peter and Paul over the question of what the Gentiles had to do to become Christians. Paul, as we know, was adamant that they should not be expected to become culturally and ritually bound Jews. Abstaining from sexual immorality and offerings to idols became the only conditions the Gentiles had to observe. And this is what I like to call, in inverted commas, the Jerusalem Compromise. Now, in Asia, they encountered civilizations that they came to identify as the new Greeks and Romans of their time. And for their compositio loci, they chose to perform a grand experiment. Namely, they attempted to merge the Pauline scene of the Areopagus with the realities of Ming China and Warring States Japan. Thus, their memory and a reimagination of the primitive church of the first century became their new theological commonplace. But there was a fundamental difference with the primitive church of the first century. As Valignano put it very succinctly, quote, "The Lord does not come to the aid of the Japanese church with miracles, unlike in the primitive church. Thus, interior virtue must be accompanied by exterior forms of persuasion, wherein the bonzes of Japan excel," unquote. And as Paul had listened to and learned from his Gentile interlocutors, so too the Jesuits learned a great deal about cultural adaptation from their Japanese and Chinese interlocutors. They didn't just invent this idea by themselves. These interlocutors made it clear to them that they could achieve absolutely nothing if they did not respect the ancient civilizations of their East Asian hosts. Looking back to the Areopagus for inspiration, men like Matteo Ricci attempted to reinterpret the entire Confucian tradition in terms that rejected what he deemed the atheistic tendencies of Ming Neo-Confucianism, which is a school that started in the 13th century. In its place, he proposed to return to the wisdom of the sages of the Zhou dynasty, which goes back to the second century before Christ. The second millennium before Christ, when the Chinese had worshipped a transcendent and more personal force in the universe, which they referred to as Shangdi, or Lord on High. Now, educated in an age that looked to recover the wisdom and erudition of classical antiquity, the vision of an East Asia as a new primitive church gave new impetus and purpose to the way they employed rhetoric as a privileged apostolic tool. They needed to begin with a search for the right words, and this required them to engage in a serious study of the classical languages of Japan and China. For the Jesuits in East Asia, the proclamation of the gospel thereby became part of a process of reinventing the Christian message, whereby invention, we take its original Latin meaning as the discovery, inventio, of persuasive arguments with which, as Cicero had taught, the missionaries should 1. Move the hearts, 2. Instruct the minds, and 3. Delight the emotions of their Japanese and Chinese audiences. Thus, before one could begin to construct complex theological arguments, one needed to discover, in venire, the appropriate individual words to express that faith. But the search for such persuasive arguments was not simply an exercise in external eloquence. I would argue that the search for the right words with which to make the Christian kerygma comprehensible was a reenactment of the incarnation of that message. The ars benedicendi of ancient Rome had now to become once again the ars bene evangelizzandi. The underlying premise was that all humankind shared in a common nature, and that the natural law was where the seeds of God's grace could be found. This made it possible to proclaim the gospel anew in a way that was rooted in and based, at least in part, on traditions that were already a part of Chinese and Japanese history and culture. In this way, Christianitas, defined as a nexus of faith and culture in the Judeo and now Greek and Roman mold, was, in inverted commas, reinvented, and its cultural and mental borders were now extended to include and embrace East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's move to India.
Thank you. I understand our task would be today to point out some distinguishing features, so I will not attempt to repeat things that have already been made by John and Anthony, but rather to move on from here. The first would be to say on the common ground that the Society of Jesus in India, particularly I'm thinking of the pre-suppression period, so the first 2 centuries or so of Jesuit presence in India, is very much a society in interaction with the society in East Asia, even the society in the Americas. You see the letters back and forth through Rome, the conduits going to the east and to the west. So a great kind of world conversation taking place in which one would not expect that the Jesuits in India would have an entirely unique experience. So I think that would be a starting point to understand that the continuity of the society and its charism, as John was pointing out, would be expected to work out in the Indian context as well. The society in India, likewise, again, in this earlier period, there are European Jesuits in India. A number of great figures stand out, and they stand for different kinds of expertise and different kinds of scholarship, beginning with Francis Xavier. So while Francis Xavier is often identified with Japan and the effort to go to China, his first experience in Asia was in India. And his first experience of meeting a sustained non-Christian culture was in India. He was not there long enough to engage in any deep study, and perhaps he was not inclined for that study in any case. But nonetheless, he did really find his encounter with the East to begin in the Indian context. Several generations after him, and very much in the spirit of Matteo Ricci, we have Roberto de Nobili from the first half of the 17th century, who, like some of the Jesuits in East Asia, but perhaps more intensely working on his own, attempted to truly fit into the culture of South India, to learn the languages, Tamil, the local language, Sanskrit, the classical language, to adapt himself to the culture, to dress like a Hindu holy man, to become part of the culture, strictly vegetarian, strictly following the norms of the ascetics of the culture, even in one of his letters saying, if only I could also change the color of my skin to fit in with the darker skinned people of South India, I would be entirely here. And wrote a number of very interesting treatises which have not yet been fully studied in the Indian context in Tamil, perhaps 10 or 12 books in Tamil that are still worth our study. After him, we have, at the end of the period, in the mid-18th century, Gaston Laurent Cordoue, one of the last Jesuits to be a serious scholar in India before the society left India at the time of the suppression. Cordoue is really an anthropologist, and as we see in other parts of the world, the Jesuit scholarship turning toward able, adept, attentive description of the culture, not simply the religion, and not even simply for the sake of apology or conversion, but rather what are the marriage customs? What are the funeral customs? What are the languages? What are the meals? How do these people live out their lives? Where do they live? The geographical descriptions. And when many a modern scholar looks back to the beginnings of the modern Indological study of India, Cordoue is one of the figures who is mentioned. the well-known 19th century figure Abbé Dubois, a figure who was not a Jesuit, who wrote his book on the customs of the Indians, borrowed most of that book from Cordo's work. And there's a great sense of this kind of anthropological scholarship. And then on a quite different level, Constantine Besky, at the end of the 17th century, a great literary scholar who learned beautiful Tamil, classical language, who wrote an epic account of the life of Saint Joseph in Tamil, and honored as one of the founders of modern Indian Tamil style of poetry, writing that could be published. Even that such in the 1960s, when the Tamil government was putting up in Madras by the beach statues of great figures in South Indian literary history. One of them is of Besky, a remarkable tribute. So we have a range of figures like this who make a great impression in the South Indian context, and I think deserve a great deal more study. Yet nonetheless, I think, as would be true in other parts of the world, these exceptional figures were possible only because there was the larger group of Jesuits doing other kinds of work, running mission stations, doing work with the poorest of the poor, particularly in India along the Fisher Coast, Jesuits running schools, that there was a great kind of network of Jesuits in India that enabled these exceptional individual scholars to do their work. And anytime, as with East Asia, we look to these exemplary figures who come down to us because of their writing, we realize that it's part of the larger work of the society in the Asian context, and it's the same true in India. Another thing to note that I think we cannot take for granted is that while today even the Christian population of India is very small, 2 or 3% out of 1.2 billion people, nonetheless, the Jesuits actually were among those who helped to establish real Christian communities in India. There are still Indian families, both in the Kerala on the west side, Tamil Nadu on the east side, who trace their family conversion back to Francis Xavier, or who see that the mission of de Nobili, John de Brito, and other of the early, most famous and most well-known Jesuit missionaries brought to them a deep and lasting Christianity which was able to survive all these centuries until now. You can also note that the largest number of Jesuits in the world by far now is Indian, that there are over 4,000 Indian Jesuits, and this is a remarkable flourishing of the society outside the European context, outside the West, unparalleled anywhere else in the world. And I might add that I don't have statistics here, but that the incredible number of Jesuit colleges and schools and educational institutions in India is remarkable. After college, I spent 2 years up in Kathmandu at St. Xavier's School, which was really just the farthest north of this vast network of schools, most of which are named Loyola or Xavier, all over India. An incredible kind of vigorous, outside the American or European context, commitment to education that has flourished from the 19th century on. So all of this, I think, is interesting and yet in continuity with the Jesuit presence elsewhere in the world. I would like for the other side of my reflection here to point out what I think are 6 distinguishing features that perhaps make us think a little bit differently about these pre-18th century Jesuits or pre-suppression Jesuits in the Indian context. First of all, is simply the fact that Europe had different attitudes toward India than it did toward East Asia. And that if one looks at not simply Jesuit scholarship, but the scholarship of European writing about Asia, the certain kind of fascination that was had for China, for Japan, often India fell in the shadow of that interest. And that in some circles, the truest and best and highest of the Asians were the Chinese and the Japanese. There may have been strands of European scholarship in the 19th century, in particular in Germany, let's say, who were most fascinated by India. But nonetheless, there's a different attitude toward the Indians and the East Asians. And I think that may play out even in the fact of the quality of the scholarship that has been done in the 20th century about the Jesuits in Asia. There is so much more to be done about the Jesuits in India. I often am jealous of the studies of the Jesuits in China and Japan. By comparison, there are so many palm leaf manuscripts sitting on shelves that have not even been read of what happened in those early Jesuit centuries in India. Another distinguishing feature is that the Jesuits and the Portuguese and the missionaries who came to Goa after 1500 did not bring Christianity to India for the first time. Any of you, I'm sure you're aware of the traditions of St. Thomas, the apostle, who went to India by tradition after the crucifixion and ascension of Jesus. And it was certainly possible. I mean, it's hard to go back and find historical records that would prove this, but there was traffic back and forth between the Roman Empire and India in that time period. And there are very devoted, dedicated Christian communities in Kerala in particular on the West Coast, which insist that they are Thomas Christians, that they trace themselves back to Thomas. In any case, when the Portuguese came and the Jesuits came, there already were well-established Christian traditions in what today we would call the Syriac traditions, the Eastern traditions, Syro-Malabar, Syro-Malankar, and that these traditions had a hard time when the Portuguese came, when the Roman Church came, when the Jesuits were involved in trying to Romanize everyone. And this different dynamic of bringing the mission of the gospel to India and finding that there are already Christian communities well established changed the dynamic. And I think ever since then there's been a sense of the struggle to say, well, what does it mean to be an Indian Christian? And whatever we talk about with the heritage back to Francis Xavier, there's also the heritage back to Thomas the Apostle. And that, I think, is part of the story that needs to be remembered. Is also the sense that there's an ideal, which probably was rarely in Christian history lived out, of converting the emperor, converting the king, and then everyone else below would also become Christian, so Constantine, or going to the Chinese court and hoping to win over the emperor. There are instances of this in the Indian context, like the Mughal Emperor Akbar, and the Jesuits and others in the court trying to persuade him to take Christianity seriously. And there was the mission. It never led to any substantial return. But more typical were the fact that there was no centralized government for India, no centralized ruler or hierarchy of rulers. There were many maharajas, local kings, that the Jesuits had to deal with in different places, and often had to deal much more with local power structures, local family structures, caste structures, clan structures within villages and neighborhoods, where in fact one had to deal with the village headmen, the village leaders, rather than looking up in a political hierarchy. And even as rulers changed in India, Muslim rulers, Hindus rulers of various sorts, it was often those enduring clan structures, family structures that mattered most, which meant on the negative side, and there surely are parallels in other parts of the world, the Jesuit engagement and encounter with the caste system. And that this is a feature that is still an issue today for Christians, Catholics, Jesuits in India, caste identity, being of a caste, being Christian, being Indian, all of these things interconnected. But the kind of trade-off between wanting to be persuasive in the culture by living according to the norms of caste so as to gain a hearing, and then being implicated in structures that are often considered to be unjust. I think this fact of caste, particularly when there was no overarching political system with an emperor on top or a ruler on top, often said the power was dissipated among these many different forces that the Jesuits had to constantly be negotiating. There's also the fact, number 4 of my 6 points, that the Jesuits in India were in a sense meeting a more familiar set of religious traditions, which may sound odd when one thinks of the kind of Hinduism they must have encountered, the temples, the deities from Kali to Krishna, the traditions, the fire sacrifices, and so on. But nonetheless, because of the common Indo-European roots of Roman and Greek religion and the Sanskrit traditions of India, there were parallel mythology, parallel social structures, parallel words in different languages. One can find between Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek common terminology once you begin to understand the linguistic frame, that this was not an entirely different kind of religious structure. And in one of the struggling things that the Jesuits had to deal with was great devotions to personal deities, and that the deities they met in India were not an entirely different conception of ultimate reality, but personal, loving, gracious deities that they had to negotiate what the difference is between the personal, loving Christian deity as compared to Krishna, Rama, Shri, Lakshmi, and so on. That this changed the dynamic, that sometimes the similarities could be more challenges than radical difference. And then finally, you might say that in terms of this similarity, they found their other in the Brahmins, that there are parallels, I'm sure, with the elite intellectuals in China and Japan, but in terms of ascetic, learned, intellectuals of Indian tradition, like it or not, the Jesuits and Brahmins kind of were bound together. And that in some ways it was both a compliment, Jesuits are just like Brahmins, and at another level, a deep insult, the Brahmins and Jesuits are almost indistinguishable. And the heritage down to the 20th century and 21st century of the kind of intellectual elites that are also religious elites, power elites, that Jesuits and Brahmins had for one another. And then the final point I would say is that, and I think this is a different kind of point, is that what does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be Hindu? What does it mean to be an Indian Christian are all complicated, intertwining themes. And that one of the issues that I think Indian Christians struggle with today, or scholars who go to India to study Hinduism, can you really understand this and be at home in India unless you become part of Hinduism in some way? And that the work that somebody like Robert de Nobili did of reaching the edge by the way he dressed, by the way he spoke, by the way he ate, was it really possible to understand Hinduism without in some way becoming a Hindu? And the sense of who are you if you are not really inside this tradition in a deeper way that would have been considered unacceptable to many of the pre-suppression Jesuits in India. That you can study about it, you can think about it, you can philosophize about it, but in some way you have to become part of it. And even today, I think the debates among Jesuits, Christians, Catholics, and Hindus in India, what does it mean to be an Indian, is in some way going to include a Hindu identity as well. So with that last point, I'll stop there.
Now we move to Iberoamerica. As Father O'Malley said, obviously the other mendicant orders had already been missionaries throughout the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires, but the Jesuits also found very unique missions, particularly in South America, in the reduction of Paraguay. So to tell us about the Guarani mission, Professor Ganson.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And one of the questions that I had when I was doing my research on the Guarani Jesuit missions, which are the most celebrated missions in the New World, was what kind of historical memories do the peoples have of the Jesuits today? And as a former student at the Catholic University in Asunción, I spent several days in a Guarani village, the Avad Chiripa, on the border with Paraguay and Brazil, thinking that if I interview shamans, using an interpreter to help me understand this particular dialect of Guarani, that I'd be able to record impressions of their early contact with the Jesuits. But after several days of being there and listening to their stories, I learned that they really had no recollections of Jesuits at all. And there was probably one group that had left, had some contact, but then fled further into the jungles of South America. But it was in a town, in an Argentine village called Loreto, where I found a direct connection between the Jesuits from the 18th century with people of today. And Loreto is a village where people still often ride on horseback. And there was one Argentine there. His name was Pedro Chapay, and the last name Chapay is a Guarani name, and and he actually worked for the local city town of Loreto. But if you go to the 18th century censuses of Corpus Christi, one of the missions in Argentina, that the name Chapay shows up. And his distant ancestor was also a member, like a secretary of the Cabildo, or local town council. And it was only in this town that I could find a direct connection between the Guarani, the very famous Guarani missions of Paraguay among the Jesuits with the people of today. And interestingly, his mother had original Baroque artwork still in their house, and during the religious processions, they bring those out to parade through the streets. And so it's interesting that I could find that connection, not among the Guarani, but among Creole population. many of whom have left the small town. And the town itself was founded during the chaos of the Wars of Independence. And it looked like a small Jesuit mission. And what fascinated me was that the Jesuits brought to the indigenous peoples new concepts of urbanism, science. One thing that the Jesuits did was they were able to germinate yerba mate, which was like the main product of actually it was like used as currency, but widely consumed throughout southern South America, as far as places as distant as Chile and Peru, which became very popular during the colonial period. But was the most unique characteristic of the Guarani Jesuit missions is that the Guarani were armed by the Jesuits, and in as early as 1637, Father Antonio de Montoya traveled to Spain to ask for royal permission to form militias, and together the Jesuits and the Guarani were able to put an end to Indian slavery in 1642, and once that confrontation of having undergone Indian slavery, for several decades, during which as many as 60,000 Guarani had been carried off from Paraguay to Brazil, the Guarani Jesuit missions were able to prosper. And the Jesuits came again, of course, to convert the Guarani, but they built mission schools. If you wanted to study music in the Rio La Plata, you actually had to travel from Buenos Aires up to the missions themselves, because the Jesuits had introduced a whole repertoire of new musical instruments to the Guarani, including the musical harp, which is widely played today. And they brought new concepts of astronomy and other science. And the other unique aspect is they taught the Guarani how to read and write in their native language using a Latin or Roman alphabet. And during the crisis of the 1750s, the Guarani wrote letters of protest before they took up arms against the Spanish and Portuguese following the signing of the treaty. And the Jesuits gave the Guarani a sense of empowerment, which they utilized to defend their interests, but sadly, they were not successful in that rebellion. But their practice of letter writing went far beyond the period of the Jesuits into the late 18th century and early 19th century. And it's a fascinating world for us as historians to understand their adaptation. And I'll stop right there.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, talking of slave owning, of course, we know that the Jesuit mission in Maryland was based on slave owning plantations. And again, which is a very different kind of mission. We could compare with the other missions in New France and New Spain, but also for instance, in Ethiopia. We had today a discussion. We have here with us also Professor Andreu Martinez, who has written on the Jesuit mission in Ethiopia. So it's the interesting thing is both the global character of the mission and yet the diversity of the encounters and the way in which the Jesuits understood their global mission in very, very concrete, different ways in different contexts. So is there anything that you would like to exchange among yourselves before we open up the floor for discussion? Anything that called your attention?
One thing. I was struck particularly by what Father Clooney said about what does it mean to be an Indian, what does it mean to be an Indian Christian. This is certainly in Japan still a problem today, which is why this is very interesting, and we're not just doing historical archaeology with this symposium and talking about historical elements. We're actually looking at problems that still irk you could say, the peoples and Christian converts in East Asia. And of course, I'm sure many of you have heard of the famous Japanese Catholic novelist, the most famous Catholic novelist of the 20th century, Endo Shusaku, and one of the most famous novelists of Japan, period, in that century. And he famously spoke about Christianity, and he was a Catholic himself till the end of his life. He said it's like an ill-fitting Western-style suit, which there never really completely feels comfortable. And that's very, very interesting. He said there's something that there's still a process that we have to undergo, and something which to our Western world seems so absurd, but to a Japanese even, I've been asked this question, if this is universal salvation, then why was Jesus Christ a Jew? Why was he not born in Japan? In fact, there is a whole village in Japan where Christ has supposedly escaped the crucifixion, went to Japan, died, had a family, died, and is actually buried. There's this grave. You can go to Christ's grave in Japan. So this idea that if he's not Japanese and it doesn't come into our culture, then there's something that's wrong. And I can see people laughing, but it's so strange to us because we've already gone through the whole process of Judeo-Christian conversion of pagans, and that's become our culture. But this hasn't happened yet in East Asia.
And it may not happen until who knows when.
Maybe another 1,000 years.
Okay, please. Comments, questions from the floor? We have about half an hour, so please. Please. Please identify yourself.
My name is Lawrence Rosano. In India, the Jesuit universities, you don't have to be a Jesuit, a Catholic to go to them, right? Right. And just generally, how much is the percentage of like Hindus would go to the Catholic university the Jesuits run?
I mean, I can easily stand to be corrected on this, but I would say almost any Jesuit college I've been to in India or secondary school, including the one I taught at in Kathmandu, it would be 90% or more Hindu or Muslim in some cases. That there may be some reservation for maybe the Nepal case was exaggerated because there are fewer Christians there. But certainly I would say almost all the schools, a majority would be not Christian. That's my estimate, and somebody could correct me on that, but I think that's the case. So the idea was education for everyone.
Tell us about Sophia, the proportion of Catholics, students and faculty at Sophia.
Well, students, I'd say probably we're looking at 97% non-Christian. There'd be more faculty. I'd say we probably go up to 5 or 10% maybe Catholic faculty at Sophia University. Again, I think we once had a maximum of like 25% perhaps. And this is the 100th anniversary, by the way, of Sophia University in Tokyo, founded in 1913, but the numbers are more or less that still today.
Well, I like the story of that Joe, who was the rector at the assistant to Father Arupe.
Father Joseph Pitao.
Father Joseph Pitao liked to say that he'd been rector president of 2 Catholic universities. One was the Gregorian University in Rome, where 98% of the students and faculty were Catholic, and also Sophia in Japan, where 98% were not Christians. So both Catholic universities.
But well, I assume that Georgetown College originally was also not thought as a college for Catholics, right?
Well, it was founded to be open to students of all faiths.
Right. Please. Please.
I'm Michael Calabria. I'm a chaplain in residence here. This question is probably for Father Clooney, but perhaps others have an opinion. Understanding that the goal of the missionaries was to convert the Hindus and the Muslims of India. Given the enculturation, is there a disconnect with the institution of the Goa Inquisition? How do those things fit together with in one sense, admiring Hindu practices such as a vegetarian diet and the texts and whatnot, and yet going to the extent of instituting Inquisition to root out any of those indigenous elements in Christianity?
Excellent question. I would say that there were, first of all, maybe two strands operative, and the Jesuits were part of a controversy about, first of all, what does it mean to convert? And that there were some who would say that basically conversion, to put it very simply, would be burning your bridges behind you. You take a new name, you take new ways of dressing, you marry differently, you have a whole new family. And in a sense, that has to constantly be purified by inquiring into any tainting elements of what you were before. So that would be one school. The other school, I think, would be accommodation, that largely most of what we are as human beings is cultural, it is human, it is social, it is the arts, it's poetry and so on. And that can be preserved in any kind of transformation. So while somebody like Robert de Nobili and his successors in accommodation did have as their ultimate goal conversion, in a sense, I think they were often saying, well, 98%, I'm making numbers up, of what you already are will be who you are when you are a Christian. And there's a small part of turning toward Christ and radical inner transformation, banishing superstition, that would change as a Christian. But you could keep your name, keep your dress, keep your customs. But I think others were more skeptical that unless you made a much larger cultural break, it would be very ambiguous or people would slide backwards. So somebody like de Nobili would be far away from the Inquisition model, and others would be much more saying it's a necessity.
Werner Hein, a lawyer, also again on Japan and India. Has there been in modern times now, probably now last 10 years or so, any outcome control, so to speak, being established that might either measure or at least follow up on what the Jesuit education in those countries have produced? I assume that they are mostly the elites of the country, and have they maybe pursued more social policies, more in line, let's say, with the Christian beliefs? That's one. And then a sub-question, to what extent is the association, so to speak, educating the elites and the association with the elites hindering a kind of fulfilling the missionary job in the lower level on the social scale?
Go ahead.
I would say first, and certainly others are also expert on these things, or are expert more than me, that I think in the Indian context there would be, first of all, similar struggles as in the West, that when you set up a very good educational institution, it often becomes an elite institution. It's more expensive, more selective, and ends up with a certain part of the population is that part of the population which is drawn to it. But my sense is that even traditionally, although, and I'd have to go doing record like 19th century Jesuit colleges in Trichy and so on, that in more modern times, there's always a sense of social obligation as well. I know when I was in Kathmandu teaching in the 70s, the school itself was very elite, but nonetheless there were scholarship for boys from the hills, that there wasn't a large urban poor population in the 1970s, but from way out in the hills, these small towns, there would be ways of bringing them in so they would be part of the education, jostling with the town folk. And I think today, particularly in the South, which I'm more familiar with, but I think it'd be true in the North, a responsibility of increasing the Dalit population or the tribal population in the schools and making sure that education is not just in the hands of the upper classes. In the South, in Madras or Chennai as it's now called, there's actually a new mission, the Chennai mission, which deliberately has as part of its very identity the outreach to the poorer populations of South India with colleges, schools, and so on, particularly for those who had been excluded from the more elite schools in the past. But how this worked out longer ago, others might have to speak to that.
Well, I only know India from having heard about it, but I think the situation in Japan is quite different. Also, the socioeconomic situation is different. Not that there are not poor people in Japan today, but it is, I guess, one of Japan's great successes, which is creating this rather very large middle class. So, yes, Sophia University as a private university is, in inverted commas, one of the elite universities, but it's not so in the sense that it gives the impression of being somewhere that you can only go to if you're very, very rich. So that is not an impression that you get in Japan, even though it is expensive because it doesn't get the type of subsidies which are a defining element of public universities in Japan, which is why the large national universities in Japan will always be considered the top, because they have 10, 100, 1,000 times more funds than any private university ever will, no matter how many centuries we wait, if the present system continues. There's a lot of work, quiet work that's going on with regard to very poor populations, but it's more part of a Jesuit strategy of social work. Now that has spilled over into the university with the School of Social Welfare. I'm talking about Sophia University, where a lot of work is being done in this area, and Sophia has just taken over also a Catholic nursing school with the idea of creating a new faculty which is going to be called, it's not decided yet, but a faculty on the study of human dignity, which will combine social welfare, nursing, medical ethics, and things like this. One area where I hope that as a university there will be a possibility of development, which I think in many of the Jesuit universities in the United States has been a great success, is having a service component built into the curriculum. This in Japan is tricky. You can have it as a volunteer activity, but it's very difficult to say you have to do this sort of social work or this sort of interaction with society, otherwise you don't get credit. It's tricky in terms of both social and religious organization, because there are, like the Soka Gakkai, this enormously powerful religious Buddhist group in Japan, which has also been in government as one of the important parties in Japanese government, and they have a very strong vision in this line. And that way of using religion for direct social action is not something the Japanese automatically look at as something positive.
Please.
John Garrity. During this time, we take it that the Jesuits were following on the Portuguese and the Spanish explorers and using their bases as jumping off points in these countries or in the region. But at the time, the popes would have been much more interested in what was going on in Europe with the Protestant reforms and challenges. To then what extent did Rome think of these as just sort of Jesuit new experiments and leave the Jesuits alone, or did the popes and the Rome take an active interest in these experiments?
John, I think you're the person.
I think it's very important to realize that the popes basically did not have any interest in missions. They were concerned about the Papal States. They were concerned about the Ottoman Turks, and to some extent they were concerned about the Reformation. In general, they were in favor of the evangelization that was going on, but this was basically the job of the King of Spain, the King of Portugal, and the religious orders. So this was what they did. And I think it's very significant that the Council of Trent, which met between 1545 and 1563, and of course, the evangelization of the Indies had been going on now for well over 60 years. There's not a mention of missions in the Council of Trent. This is simply not something that the bishops, or indeed the Pope, were concerned. It was not their job. They were in favor of it, so forth. So, as Sabina Pavoni has shown, we talked about this morning, it was not until 1622 that the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith was created, and at that point, the Holy See began to take a more active interest. Of course, it was building up that time, but so it was the religious orders, not just the Jesuits, the religious orders had pretty much a free hand. Wouldn't you say that was true, Sabine? Yeah.
Can I add one thing to that? Yeah. There's one episode which is interesting, again, a well-known episode, and someone who came close to, I'd say, being at least publicly supportive of the missions, in particular in Japan and China, was Gregory XIII in the 1580s. And in order to really create a major public event, Valignano chose 4 noble boys from Japan and sent them on this amazing journey. They were 12 years old. They were in our schools in Japan, and on very short notice, they left in 1582 and spent 8 years traveling first of all to Europe, all over Europe, and then all the way back, and arrived back in Japan at the age of 20 and then became Jesuits. But they were received numerous times by several popes, because Gregory XIII actually died while they were in Rome, so they also attended his funeral. And then their procession through the gate at the Piazza del Popolo for official delegations is actually painted as a fresco in the Vatican, showing the whole procession. And this was one way also for at least the Holy See, to show that we are actually winning this battle with the Protestants, because we are bringing into the fold new Christians beyond Europe, and they are nobles, and they have the same values as we do, and so they can be treated as exotic as they are, with the same respect. And it was also used for certain propaganda. And in fact, one of the first German broadsheets printed in color in 1585 in Augsburg shows the 4 boys with their Portuguese Jesuit mentor, Diogo de Mesquita, and it's a Neue Zeitung. I think it's, what was it? Neue Zeitung aus der Insel Japan, and it shows these 4 boys arriving. This is new news from this island, and this is an interesting episode. Anyway.
Can I just add also one piece, that the famous rights controversies, the Malabar rights controversy in India, the Chinese rights controversy, and the precedents, even before the official debates, about what kind of adaptations can be made in the administration of the sacraments, and that what kind of continuity of the veneration or the rites that people practiced before becoming Christian. Those often started out, as I understand at least the Indian context better, as local quarrels, disputes among the missionaries, were appealed to Goa, became issues there juridically being handled, were appealed to Rome, and eventually decrees would come from Rome about you can do this, you can't do that. But some of those had to do with perceptions of the right ordering of the sacraments, and there may have been, in the European context, a sense of, well, these are the true ways to do Christian sacraments, and we don't want to have it tainted in the missions, just as in Europe we have our opinions about these things. But so certain cases made it big, gained a lot of...
This is later.
Right. Later.
This is later. So, as again, Professor Pavoni has shown, you have that wonderful quotation from, matter of fact, from the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, don't you?
I have a quotation of 1835.
1630.
Yeah. but it's in the 18th centuries. But the quotation of the congregation of the Saint Office spoke about what they had done before. And they say that they decided to send Jesuits to convert all in every way. But now, in the 18th century, they have to be more strict because the Orthodox faith after the Council of Trent needs to be more strict about orthodoxy and so on.
I have a quotation as well from the Propaganda Fide of 1659 that says, just when the rights controversy is really heating up, quote, "What could be more absurd than to bring France, Spain, Italy, or any other European country over to China? It is not your country, but the faith you must bring, that faith which does not reject or belittle the rights or customs of any nation, as long as these rights are not evil, but rather desires that they be preserved in their integrity and fostered." And of course, within 50 years, that's going to be contradicted. In the 18th century, they will be condemned, say 1704 and 1715. But they did actually say that.
And of course, there are many more parallels between the missions, the counter-reformation missions in Europe and the rural missions. And then in the 17th century, throughout Iberoamerica, there is a lot of then forms of mission which are done in Europe, also in the East, let's say in Poland, in Ukraine, and also missions in, let's say, in Peru. Once the population has become formally Christian, but there has to be constantly indoctrination and campaigns against idolatry. So there is a process, a dynamic process that lasts for, let's say, well over 100 years, and which has similarities with the rural missions, the counter-reformation missions in Europe.
But one thing I wanted to mention, that indigenous peoples became exempt from the Inquisition after 1562. And so with time, I would say, there's, even though there were campaigns against idolatry, there was a certain amount of tolerance of like medicine men and shamans, despite the early confrontations.
Well, more in the Guaranis than in
elsewhere.
the Peru.
But then elsewhere. It's different contexts,
Spain.
different places. Right. And also, in terms of education, the Jesuits taught male children, both members of the Indian nobility, but also commoners. Literacy is a very complex subject to study, but there were numbers of Guarani caciques and members of the Indian councils that could not sign their names on letters that others had to sign for them. And then there's evidence of some indigenous having fled the mission, but still being able to write letters to one another. So it wasn't a question of nobility at all, who learned to read and write. So it varies.
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Leo Lefebvre from Georgetown. I have another question on India. Last year I was in northern part of Maharashtra and visited the Jesuit school at Talasari. And this is a network of schools among the tribal or Adivasis in the Mawarli tribe. I met the Jesuit for the first time. It translated the Gospels into the language there. So this is all kind of in action right now, and a lot of the students in the schools are the first in history of their families to be taught to read and write. But my sense is it's a very, very different world from the Hindu-dominant cultures in India. Could you say a bit about the dynamics, both of evangelization and enculturization for the Adivasi in India?
I don't have a lot of firsthand knowledge, but I can say something, and maybe others can add, is that you might say there are three constituencies for education in schools in India, not just Jesuit. But the one would be the casted peoples. And I won't talk about Islam because I'm less sure about that. But the casted group, including the middle class, we refer to the middle class in Japan. In India, you have 300 or 400 million people in the middle class. So a lot of people are there and educated. So there's that group. A second group would be deliberate outreach to what had been called the untouchable, so the low caste, the Dalit, who would be sort of off the bottom by this traditional standard, and reaching out to them and making sure that there's education available. A third group would be the tribals, groups that were sometimes never perceived of themselves as Hindu anyway, Assam, Manipur, and so on. A great outreach to those tribal communities. There are certain analogies you might draw with Native Americans, but it's mostly inexact. That outreach to those communities needs to be done differently than to Dalit communities, which are more intimately, for better or worse, connected with Hinduism, and then to the vast Hindu middle class. 3 different constituencies, schools reaching in different directions. The major Jesuit colleges and so on tend to cater to the upper reaches of that middle class, I think. But there have been and there are these efforts to reach out to the tribals, which are very exciting, I think.
And of course, the new dynamic today is the competition, you could say, between the more established Catholic mission or tradition, and of course the Pentecostal, very, very, very kind of active, dynamic Pentecostal Christians, both proselytizers from the outside, but also Christian Pentecostals moving, let's say, Tamil Pentecostal, let's say, in Mumbai, and the very, very active community. So the kind of the tension also in China between the much more rapidly growing Protestants and Catholic Chinese that basically are long familial traditions, sometimes a whole village of a Catholic village, let's say somewhere, and which has lasted for several centuries, or traditional Catholic families, which of course with the one-child policy is not growing at all, Catholicism, let's say demographically, while the Pentecostals and the other Christians through proselytizing are growing much faster than Catholics, let's say in China. So it's a different kind of dynamic, of course. Yes, yes, please.
My name is Lawrence Rosano. I just wanted to ask you about Pakistan. Is Pakistan like India or vice versa? Because I have met a priest in my parish near me, and he said, he says, very small minority of Catholics in Pakistan. He says, if you think about you convert, you'll be killed. He like shivered when he was saying it. I just wanted to understand if it was the same way in India.
No. I think that's the simplest version, is to say no. That when I was in Nepal in the 70s, there was still a constitution in place in the country that mandated that people remain in their traditional religions.
Well, then, if there are no further questions, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you, all of you, for coming.